Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the League of California Cities Latino Caucus.
We want to give it a couple minutes while people roll
Come on.
in.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to give it a couple of minutes as people are signing on. And we've got one more speaker, and there he is. Matt, welcome. Oh, Matt, you're still on mute. Okay.
There you go. Hi, everyone.
Okay, we're going to get ready in 10 seconds.
We're going to get ready to go in 10 seconds.
Oh, good timing.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the League of California Cities Latino Caucus. This is our special event on post-2020 election analysis with a Latino perspective. Before I go into the program, I wanted to thank our sponsor for this particular event, Coca-Cola. Peter Villegas was not able to join us today, but they are our banner sponsor for this particular event. So thank you, Coca-Cola. We have a great program for today and some great speakers. Many of the speakers that you've heard of before, you know for over the years. And obviously the subject matter today, the 2020 elections, which was probably one of the most controversial elections in decades. And one where the Latino vote was not a question as to will they vote this time around, but a question more of, how they will vote and what the impact was going to be, across the nation, in various states, and at the local level. So again, we've got some great speakers with us today. I'm going to start out with a brief introduction. Just so you know, you will all be on mute during the course of this program today. However, we do encourage you to submit your questions in the chat box, and we will try to answer as many of those as possible throughout the program. With that said, our speaker and moderator for this program is Fernando Guerra. Fernando Guerra is the director of the Thomas and Dorothy Liddy Center for the Study of Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University. He earned his PhD and master's in political science from the University of Michigan and his BA from USC in international relations. Dr. Guerra has been a principal and investigator in over 20 major studies on the Los Angeles leadership studies and electoral politics. He is a regular source to the media for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, to just mention a few. So thank you, Dr. Guerra. We also have with us today someone that many, if not all of you know, is Arturo Vargas from NALEO. Arturo is a CEO for the NALEO Educational Fund, which is a national nonprofit organization that strengthens American democracy by promoting the full participation of Latinos in civic life. He is also the CEO of NALEO, a national membership organization of Latino policymakers and their supporters. He has held these positions since 1994. Arturo is a national recognized expert in Latino demographic trends, electoral participation, voting rights, census, and redistricting. Arturo holds a master's degree in education and a BA degree in history and Spanish from Stanford University. And finally, we also have Matt Barreto, co-founder of Latino Decisions. Matt is a professor of political science and Chicana studies at UCLA and a co-founder of Latino Decisions. Time magazine once called Latino Decisions the gold standard in Latino American polling. The Huffington Post has said that Barreto was a pollster that truly had the finger on the pulse of the Latino electorate. In 2020, Barreto was hired by the Joe Biden presidential campaign to direct polling and focus groups, research, and for the Latino voters. So here you are going to be getting some very inside information. I'm looking forward to this. In 2016, Barreto also conducted polling and focus groups for the Hillary Clinton campaign, presidential campaign. That same year, he also directed Latino outreach for two U.S. senators. The firm has also been hired by the DCCC to conduct national focus groups to better identify the needs of Latino voters at the national level. He's received his PhD from the University of California, Irvine. And again, I'm John Arriaga. I'm the Executive Director for the Latino Caucus. I will join you again at the end of this program. We hope you enjoy it. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Fernando.
Thanks, John. Greatly appreciated. I was just reflecting that when we've done these postmortems, I've been at Loyola Marymount University for over 30 years, and we had very little data. And not only has Latino politics changed, but the institutions and the structures. When I take a look at the Latino Caucus of the California League of Cities, or the Latino Caucus of the California State Legislature, or NALEO, or Latino Decisions, the infrastructure that we now have to assess Latino politics, to help Latino politics, is just so tremendous. And you see it obviously in the numbers of Latinos that have voted. I mean, I've known Arturo for over 30 years when he was still at Maldiv and had hair. I've known Barreto since he was a graduate student, and John Arriaga, I mean, we've been collaborating for over 20 years. And so you have now a set of relationships and history, and you just seen the growth of Latino elected officials that obviously Arturo knows very well and could speak about, but here in California is just tremendous. One of the main points I always like to make is people don't really pay attention anymore to California or Latinos in the presidential elections. They just take it for granted. But I like to remind people that California was a red state for a long, long time. And it's not until 1992 that it finally went to the Democrats, and not with the majority vote. Remember, Clinton got less than half the votes nationally because of third party. But it was Latinos that changed the entire political landscape by changing California. Without California being a safe democratic state, you're not gonna have the calculations that we talk about. So even though Latinos and California get ignored in presidential elections, it is the base from which the electoral map unfolds. And that's why there was such a focus on Florida and Texas as well. If either of those two states change, it will again change and be a seismic difference that will occur. I think that we always have to keep that in mind. The number one thing about this election regarding Latinos is that in absolute numbers, it was a tremendous turnout. It's just absolutely the largest number of Latinos that have turned out nationally and in most jurisdictions, and that's a given. And what I want to do is really take advantage of Matt and Arturo here, and start with Arturo to see in terms of tremendous Latino voter turnout, but then what is the impact going to be on Latino representation in Congress, the states, and any other aspect that you could talk about? And then I'll turn it over to Matt. Arturo, what are some of the takeaways from a representation perspective?
Thank you, Fernando. Well, I think the big takeaway is that we had a historic turnout in Latino voters. Now, every single presidential election that we can remember has always had a historic turnout, simply because our electorate is growing so fast. So every election represents, more voters than the previous presidential election. But I think this one is going to set itself apart in terms of the increase being far beyond what we had projected. We at NALEO Educational Fund projected that about 14.6 million Latinos would vote in this presidential election cycle. According to the data we saw in terms of just early voters, it was about 10.5 million who voted before November 3rd. So we think we're clearly on track to surpass that projection and approach 15, perhaps 16 million Latinos having voted in this election. And one of the big stories is the impact of the Latino youth vote. When we looked at the demographic breakdown of who voted early, the largest segment was, the two largest segments were Latinos ages 18 to 29. They represented 21% of all early voters among Latinos. And the largest segment were 50 to 64-year-olds, who represented about 25% of early voting Latinos. Now, to see young Latinos come out in those kinds of numbers, I think had an impact, not just on turnout, but even on some of the elections. In terms of what we saw with regard to Latino candidates, to be candid, we didn't see as many gains in the Congress as we thought we would in terms of a net change in the number of House seats held by Latinos. Right now, it looks like we'll be at 38 Latinos in the US House. There will be a number of new faces, at minimum 6 new faces, 4 of them Republicans. Carlos Jimenez, who will be the new congressman from South Florida, who beat Debbie Murcasel Powell. Maria Elvira Salazar, who beat Donna Shalala. We have Nicole Milocares, who from Staten Island, who identifies as Latina, who unseated an incumbent Democrat there. And then Tony Gonzalez in Texas, who won the very competitive border district from El Paso down to the Rio Grande Valley, held by Bill Hurd. He beat a Filipina candidate named Gina Ortiz Jones. There will be 2 new Democrat Latinos in the House, Teresa Ledger Fernandez from New Mexico, and Richie Torres from New York, Afro-Latino and openly gay, so some history being made out of New York in terms of Latino candidates. Of course, the big story at the federal level is the election of Ben Ray Lujan to the United States Senate. That brings our number of Latinos in the Senate now to 6. And with the election of Kamala Harris as Vice President-elect, when she takes office, her Senate seat will be vacant. And many of us here in California are working very hard to convince the governor that her replacement to complete her term really needs to be a Latino or Latina to represent the state with the largest number of Latinos in the union. Another big story that we saw was the election of another Latino to statewide office that brings the number of Latino executives, state executives, to 17. And that includes Ana Tovar, who was elected to the Corporation Commission of the state of Arizona. It's a legislative body, but it's elected statewide. And there is another Latina on that body already, Lee Peterson, who won re-election. So now we have 2 Latinas in Arizona. So that is a story there about the change of the Latino vote in Arizona, that you can see Latino candidates running now statewide and being elected statewide in both parties. Those are some of the highlights I would identify right now. We're still doing a lot of wrap-up work in terms of what the changes were in state legislative seats that we follow very closely. We think there will be a net gain in state senators. Unfortunately, we think there may be a net loss in the number of Latinos and Latinas in the lower houses of state legislatures, largely because a number of sitting legislators ran for higher office and were not replaced in their races by other Latinos or Latinas. We saw that in California, for example, with the election of a couple of state senators, like Monique Limon is an example of that, is going to the Senate, but her seat not being held, continuing to be held by a Latina or Latino. So those are some takeaways overall that I have. I think it was an exciting election, lots to understand about the performance of Latinos geographically and by national origin, which I think Matt probably can get into some of those details.
Yeah, so Matt, I think the importance of Latino decisions cannot be underscored. I think if you could give the audience a little bit about why you started Latino Decisions and what you've been doing, and then of course, what are some of the findings you have now? More polling has been done about Latinos by Latino Decisions than everything else combined in the history of polling. And so that shows you the dependence that we have on Latino Decisions and the work that they are doing. Matt is also a professor of political science and a professor of Chicano studies at UCLA. Matt, talk a little bit about the origins of Latino Decisions and then what you guys did and some of the findings you had for this cycle.
Yeah, thanks, Fernando, for that generous introduction. It's great to be on this panel with you and, of course, Arturo and John. It's great to be talking about the role of Latinos after this historic election. So we started doing this in the 2008 campaign cycle. And I can remember talking to you about this when we were first getting started and getting advice and ideas. And, you know, back then, very few people were paying close attention to Latinos. We were just starting to come into the, you know, political foray as relevant outside of California, outside of Texas. And so as presidential national politics was concerned, we still weren't seeing a lot of good data. And Gary Segura and I were complaining about that. You were complaining about that, Arturo. All of us were saying, why is our community not being represented with accurate data? And so that was our first mission, was just, can we take our social science, political science methodology of doing accurate surveys and apply that nationally so that people in Washington, D.C. actually understand what Latino voters want, what they think about in terms of public opinion. One of the first things that we got a lot of attention for was a survey we did about the Affordable Care Act back in 2009, 2010, about how Latinos were very supportive. They had the most to gain. We had very low rates of insurance. We made sure in those polls that we had accurate numbers of immigrants, Spanish speakers, people without high school degrees, that it was balanced. And so we just wanted to tell that story, that what is on the Latino agenda. And back then, that poll that we got a lot of attention out, one of our first ones, was about healthcare, continues to be the #1 policy issue of concern to Latinos, independent of COVID, but now amplified because of COVID. Our community continues to lack in terms of access and affordable access to quality healthcare. And so we will continue to ask people questions about that and make sure that that story is told. I will also say that as Latino data has really grown, we are still collecting a lot. We're working in partnership with a lot of groups like NALEO and Mi Familia Vota and Unidos, Somos. But other people are starting to collect Latino data, whether on purpose or by accident. And I say this because you're starting to see little crosstabs and breakouts for Latino voters in other states. It is appalling to me that in 2020, that in this presidential cycle, let me give you 2 examples of things that are outrageous. #1, that only about half, as far as I can estimate, of the mainstream polls in Florida were conducted bilingually in Spanish. Only about half. About half of those polls in Florida that were cataloged on 538 had Spanish samples. And that was because Gary and I would ask and inquire on each one. And so today, that is the highest Spanish-speaking state is Florida. And half of the pollsters are still not doing their effort to include Latinos. And so we need to fix that. We were doing polling with Univision this cycle across battleground states, started in the primary. And I think we had 3 or 4 polls in Florida to sort of document and catalog what happened there. The second is that Arizona, our other very high intensity battleground state, which came onto the field this year. There was a poll by CNN late in the cycle that you can still find on their website, that when you click on it and look at the crosstabs, they have a category that says Hispanic. And then underneath it, it says NA. And you look down and it says sample too small to tabulate. And so, you know, they're interviewing Latinos. They're just not even reporting our opinions. We're just missing from that data. And so again, this is why we need to be out there collecting data, collecting it from a Latino perspective so we can tell that story. And that's what we're committed to do. And to continue that, to continue to make sure we're collecting high quality, accurate Latino data. I'll just share a couple of things that have already been reported. I'll give you a couple of data points on the presidential, but I'll share a couple of things that have already been reported in some other news outlets. When we came on to the presidential campaign, only I joined the Biden campaign, and the rest of our firm, you know, firewalled ourselves off and continued to do other both client and public facing work. And when
including with us,
including with NALEO, and that's important. You know, Arturo was doing a weekly tracking poll, which got a lot of attention and was really one of the only ones accurately saying that here's where the Latino vote was. It came in right around the national estimates. But he was doing that with other folks in our firm, and I was getting the updates when they came out Tuesday morning, like the rest of America. Steven Nuno was running that for us, someone else who Fernando connected with back in the day. But, you know, when I came onto the Biden campaign, I said, I'll do this, but I'm not only going to poll in Florida and Arizona. If what you're looking for is some Latino samples in Florida and Arizona, then I'm not the one who's going to do that. You need to be interviewing Latinos in all of the battleground states. High quality, large sample, reliable samples. And they said, well, what are we talking about? And I said, well, let's go through the list of battleground states. And we did that. We did monthly polling in 9 states, Latino specific samples. That included Florida and Arizona, where we had really large samples, but we also had at least 500 in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, North Carolina. So across all of these battlegrounds, we were there doing that research and feeding that into the campaign so that Latinos could be accounted for, and so that our outreach was relevant, that it was relevant in Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin. And some of the data that we found, you know, Arturo already mentioned the very high rate of turnout. We documented the same thing, not only the early vote, but also the election day vote, from what I can have been able to glean. And let me just give you some data. The last thing I'll say, and then turn it back over to you, Fernando, is some of the data that we've been able to glean already in the 5 battlegrounds where we can credibly make the case that the Latino vote not only increased in size, but voted in a way to provide the margin of victory for the Biden campaign. Of course, at the top of that list is Arizona, which has starting to get called by more organizations. It looks like they're basically almost out of ballots now. Just a couple of, you know, stray provisionals and other votes. So Arizona is practically done counting, and we expect will be called by all organizations probably tomorrow. Over 600,000 Latino votes were cast there, over 600,000. And we think that the Latino vote by itself, and that's a low estimate. I actually think that Arizona number is going to grow to 650,000. That the Latino vote accounted for a 290,000 net contribution to the Biden margin. He's going to probably end up winning the state by 10,000. Okay. Nevada, we estimate right now, and again, these numbers could grow as we start to look at them. And I know Arturo's team is also doing the same, looking at the data as it comes in, and that's why he told you that his estimate will probably grow. I agree with him that it could hit 16 million, which would really blow away all of our expectations. 240,000 in Nevada, providing a net contribution of about 90,000 towards the Biden margin. Again, the Biden margin is right now about 25,000 in Nevada. Pennsylvania, we think 290,000 Latino votes were cast in Pennsylvania. We had an absolutely huge and robust campaign in Pennsylvania targeting Latinos, not only in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, in the Lehigh Valley, in Berks County, across the state. 116,000 net contribution in Pennsylvania. And again, that's a margin under 100,000. And we saw the same thing in places like Wisconsin and Georgia. In Wisconsin, I'm estimating right now about 100,000 Latino votes cast, providing a 44,000 vote margin for Biden. And in Georgia, and again, I think this number is low because Georgia is still processing their final ballots, 160,000. Some newer data I've seen from Georgia makes me believe that that number could actually be 190,000 in Georgia, which would just be a huge number for Latinos in Georgia, almost approaching 200,000. Right now, we think the Latino vote by itself provided a 64,000 vote margin in Georgia. So those 5 states, you know, not to mention Colorado, Michigan, where we did outreach, but those 5 states right there, the ones that were left up on the map as the final battlegrounds, we can make the case with data that it was the Latino vote, not just in Arizona, but these other states where our vote has grown so much. And now we have the data to show it, going to your opening point. So I'll leave it at there and turn it back over to you. Thank you for including me in this conversation today.
Yeah, I'd like to remind everybody that if you have a question, use the chat feature and then we'll be able to incorporate it into our discussion. Matt, I'm going to go back to you in terms of 2 questions. Number 1, the problem with polling. When we take a look at the polls, especially in Wisconsin, polling was way off. And so how can, you know, what's happening there, number 1? And then number 2, the exit polls are telling us that as high as 36% of Latinos voted for Trump. If you can comment on that thing. And then Arturo also follow up on the percent voting for Trump. Matt?
Yeah, I'll start just by talking about polling in general. you know, I think what's happened is that polling has changed dramatically since we all started this endeavor. When it used to be, you would just randomly call telephone numbers and you had a really good chance of everyone being included because that was the only mode. As we expanded into cell phones, we had to figure out how to get those cell phone numbers, what percentage of people were on cell phones, and the industry did a good job of adapting to that, all right? Now we're in a whole new uncharted territory where very few people are answering their phones. They have caller ID, they're not taking unsolicited calls. And a high percentage of people actually prefer to communicate either over text message, direct message on social media apps, or by answering forms on a tablet or on their phone. And so we are mixing in those online completes where we send people text messages, emails, or DMs on social media apps with phone completes. And we're taking a very careful look at the balance of those. You have to make sure you have the right sample. But the methodology and the mode that mainstream pollsters are using, when you go back and look at the polling averages on the five, they vary dramatically. And so there's no such thing as just a standard polling methodology. And it's incumbent on us as people gathering the data to make sure that we have an accurate sample that is demographically accurate, that we include those rural voters that might be harder to reach, and they may not be showing up in mainstream polls. Then we include Spanish speakers. And then when we do online polling, which is the new frontier of polling methodology, that we're doing it accurately. Many online samples have way too high of an urban and college-educated bias. And so when we work on our online samples, whether it's Latino or the whole general population, we set standards. We say we need to get at least this percent in Spanish. We need to get this percent as immigrant, this percent as rural, this percent with no college degree. And so you have to make sure that you're paying attention to the demographics of your data in order to get it right.
Let me turn to Arturo for a second, talk about Republicans. Now, Leo is a nonpartisan, or one could even say bipartisan organization. Some of the best activists who are even on the board are Republican elected officials. What do you think is happening in terms of the Latino vote and Trump?
You know, as Matt mentioned, we were doing a tracking poll for each week for the 9 weeks leading up to the election. And one of the questions we asked was about candidate preference between Trump and Biden. And consistently, every single week, Trump was polling between 24 and 26% of Latino registered voters that we surveyed. And then Biden was between 66 to 71%. I think when we look at the final count, that probably is going to be how it came out, with about 70-some% of Latinos voting for Biden and about 26% for Trump. But I think there's also some significant differences by national origin in terms of Mexican Americans voting much more strongly for Biden than, say, Cuban Americans, who probably split their vote. And I think the geography of it is also significant in that South Florida really turned out Republicans to vote. I mean, the president had coattails. They were able to flip 2 Democratic-held congressional seats and elect 2 Latinos, 2 Cuban Americans, Carlos Jimenez and Elvira Sanchez, in the process, and taking back a seat that was held by Ileana Ross-Layton, went to Donald Shaleda, and now it's back in the hands of a Latina. But a Republican Latina. I think it goes to the thing that we know, that there is a element in the Latino electorate that is solid Republican, that will vote Republican in every election. And there are those Latinos for whom some of the law and order arguments will resonate. We're still looking at what happened in the Rio Grande Valley in terms of an increase there of support for Trump. But I'll say statewide for Texas, when you look at the margins between the Democrat and the Republican over the last 4 presidential election cycles, you know, I thought I had these numbers memorized. Obama lost by about 11 points in 2008. He lost by 15 points in 2012. And then Hillary Clinton lost Texas by about 9 points in 2016. And Trump won Texas by 6 points. So every presidential election cycle, the margin between the Republican and Democrat is shrinking. And I think that's the impact of the Latino vote statewide. But again, geographically, you may have some other pockets where something else is happening.
So just staying on that theme, I know Matt and I have done a lot of research about California and Latinos and how it turned that blue. There's a question from James Duran who says, you know, when can we expect Latinos to impact Arizona, Texas, and Florida and turn them Democratic? In a sense, Matt, your numbers say that already happened in Arizona and it happens in Nevada. Can you speak to Texas as well?
Yeah, I think that's what we're seeing. What the effect of what we saw in California. You know, it takes time. And if you think about what happened in Arizona, really the organizing started in earnest in 2010 after SB 1070. And you're seeing that in 2018, they elected a Democratic senator. In 2020, they elected another Democratic senator. And now Biden is going to end up holding the state, not just by the narrowest margin, but Arizona is in that, you know, toss-up state and that is being pushed exactly by Latinos. What Arturo just said about Texas, all of those margins that are shrinking from 16 to 9 to 6 it correlates almost exactly with the growth of young Latinos coming into the electorate and pushing the state more Democratic. So that's going to continue. And with investment in Texas, it will get amplified. And I think the Beto Cruz election showed you that because there was investment that year, significant. A lot of it by Beto, but other outside groups jumped on. And when there was investment, it amplified, it got it down to 2.6. So that's in the works. Texas is unlikely, in my opinion, to go back to a 12-point Republican advantage. It will stay at 6 and narrow. And so that we can continue to look at. Florida is its own independent story, and that is because the demographics are different. Texas matches more consistently with an Arizona, a Nevada, a California with a large and growing young Mexican-American population. In Florida, you have the most diverse Latino population with large pockets of Cuban Americans. Puerto Ricans are now almost as large as Cuban Americans in Central Florida, but you have large South American populations, the Venezuelan community, which is small, but also votes very consistent with Republicans like Cubans do. Colombians are very large. They vote much more Democratic than you have Dominicans and a large Mexican population in Florida too. So Florida, and then you have the influx of white retirees who come to Florida and are more conservative. So that's a more difficult state. It has been a 50-50 battleground for a long time. And I think Florida stays there. But I think Texas is on that trajectory if you look at the data that Arturo gave us. And I expect Arizona, you know, will continue to push. Maybe the president won by 10,000, maybe it'll expand to 100,000. But Arizona will stay competitive, just like Nevada was. You know, Nevada was not a foregone conclusion this cycle. All of those push have been because of investment, voter registration, and then voter mobilization into the Latino community.
Hey, Matt, we're going to let you go right now. So I have one more question for you. I know he's got another commitment that has to do with probably Biden himself is calling him and asking him what to do. So
you want to get on that transition team, Fernando? Is that your question?
No, thank you. There's a lot of California local elected officials right now. What should, and most of them are in obviously heavily Latino districts, heavily Democratic, but a lot of them are also in transition and Republican areas. What does your polling or just your analysis tell you about what some trends are going to be in California, especially at the local level? And then we'll let you go.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, I think California, you know, similar to Texas, has its own different regions. And that is also true of the Latino vote. And so, you know, you have a different Latino vote in the city of Los Angeles and the Bay Area than you do in, say, the Inland Empire region or the San Joaquin Valley region. And so I'm trying to look at California Latino vote regionally as well, and to see how are folks who are out in the Inland Empire, which has a very, very large growth. That's where some of the Republican displacement has been. But Latinos out there are slightly more conservative, especially second and third generation Latinos who maybe moved there for housing opportunities and other things. In the San Joaquin Valley, we still have an under-mobilized population, huge numbers that are still slowly coming into the voter registration. And so there is still massive work to do in engagement, in getting more Latino voters out there. And I do think that for the health of California's own policy agenda, we will be benefited by having more Latino Republicans elected into the state legislature. And so in some of those battleground areas, we are already seeing Latino Republicans challenge Latino Democrats. And I think to have those perspectives, as long as they maintain a Latino focus and a Latino lens to always do what they personally think is best for our community, it's good to have those voices on both sides. And I think that's what I think you'll see. I think, we're very heavily Democrat, but I do anticipate, eventually some more Latino Republicans getting into the state legislature, city councils, and other things. And that will, in the long run, be good for our state to provide that balance.
Well, you saw that happen in California, the election of Suzette Valladares, for example, out of the Santa Clarita area.
Arturo, can I, just because I know I promised Matt that I would let him go. Matt, thank you for everything. We appreciate it. Remember, latinodecisions.com, that's the website, right? If so take a look at that. All right, thanks,
everyone.
Matt.
I'll leave you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
I'm sorry for interrupting you, Arturo. Go ahead.
No, I just was following up on Matt's point there about the election of Latino Republicans. It's still too close to call, but Mike Garcia may actually win a full term in the Congress out of the Santa Clarita Valley area. And the assembly seat that was held by Christy Smith, who challenged him, has been won by a Latino with Suzette Valladares. So you're going to have some Latino Republican representation in both the Senate and the Assembly in this next term in California. And again, from an allele perspective, you want to have people on both sides because you want to be able to engage with both political parties to move an agenda forward.
So let me ask you how comfortable you feel. I mean, Matt put out some pretty good data that says, look, the Latino vote gave a net vote that's the difference between Biden and Trump winning. Now, be aware that there's a lot of groups that can say that as well, right? Mm-hmm. African Americans, et cetera. And so when we say Latinos delivered this state, we are accurate, but not telling the complete story. And sometimes you get people push back saying, well, wait a minute, it's African Americans, especially right now with the role of Black Lives Matter and Black women and the incredible role that Black women have played. So how you, representing NALEO, a Latino organization about this, how do you respond and how comfortable do you feel pushing that Latinos made the difference?
Well, I think you have to look at it state by state. Mm-hmm. I think in Pennsylvania, African-American turnout probably had a much greater impact than the Latino turnout did on the outcome. We know that in 2016, it was a lower African-American turnout that also gave Trump an advantage in Pennsylvania and Michigan. But when you look at Nevada and Arizona, you take out the Latino votes and Biden doesn't win. So I think it really is looking at this geographically and in the states where, with the numbers that Matt was able to cite, to show that in some of these states, the margin was made up by the Latino vote. And I would say this, in terms of Biden's popular vote, right? Trump has the second highest popular vote of anybody running for president. The one with the highest is Biden. And I would say that in large measure that he has that's $4, $5, $6 million margin over Trump is the huge Latino vote from California that went towards him. I mean, that's giving him part of that huge cushion.
Yeah, I want to concentrate a little bit more on California, but let me ask you one other question that's on the chat regarding the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. Most of those counties went for Biden but some people say that Trump did better than expected. And also the turnout in the Rio Grande Valley by Latinos was lower there than the rest of the state of Texas and other places. Do you have any insight into both of those?
Well, I've been starting to look at some of the data, and it does appear that Trump won several counties, like Zapata County, Starr County, that Clinton carried by very hefty margins in 2016. There was an interesting article in the LA Times today that tried to do an analysis as to why Latinos in the Rio Grande Valley were attracted to the Trump campaign message, suggestions that it had to do with the nature of jobs in the area, the oil industry, the whole fracking conversation resonated. That the border patrol force there is heavily Mexican American, and that many people have family members who are part of the border patrol. And so the whole border conversation and law and order conversation affected people's perspectives. But I think we need to do some more analysis about that. But statewide, I think the closing of the margin between the two parties is an indication of where the rest of the state is going. In terms of turnout in the Rio Grande Valley, let's not forget, that has been the area of the state most affected by COVID-19. In terms of infection rates, hospitalization rates, mortality rates, we saw a lower participation in the Rio Grande Valley for the census. And we think in large measure that was affected by the pandemic. And perhaps the pandemic also had an effect on voter turnout. But this is all for us to continue analyzing the data. It's hard to make definitive conclusions a few days out, but the more we have time to study this, I think the more time we'll have to make some real conclusions about what happened on November 3rd.
So let me be, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to really focus more on California because this is a California audience. Obviously the census, talk a little bit about where we are on the census, and then apportionment. There's been several discussions and report that California will lose a congressional seat. I've actually seen some reports where they say California might lose 2 congressional seats. So that's one question, census, and then the apportionment of seats. And then thirdly, have we hit the threshold in California where we've captured, and I mean we Latinos have captured the easy congressional seats, the easy state legislative seats, the easy large mayoral seats that could be captured, and that there's not going to be that, there'll be some growth, but it will only be incremental, not what we've seen in the past?
So let me talk first about the census. The census now is not over. What's over is the data collection phase. But another phase that is just as important is the data processing phase. And it is a real concern, the fact that the Census Bureau does not have sufficient time, or at least the time that it says it would need to complete the data processing. And by that, I mean, they have to go through and unduplicate some forms of people who responded more than once. They have to try to put people back in the right place. This is especially true for college students. We know that there were a number of forms returned that were incomplete. And this is the time when the Census Bureau is going to try to go back and try to get some of that missing demographic data. They may not be doing it through enumerators, but through the use of third-party data, administrative records. In an ordinary year, that could take as much as 5 months. Now, the Census Bureau is going to try to do this in 2 months. Which is in my opinion, and from what I understand from the professionals at the Census Bureau, it's impossible for them to do that. It could compromise data quality to the point where for some uses of the census, it may not be sufficiently reliable. Now, the first use of the census is going to be the reapportionment. We still have a litigation battle ahead of us with the Trump administration's attempt to manipulate the number of the headcount by state by trying to remove an estimate number of undocumented immigrants by state. There's going to be an argument on November 30th at the Supreme Court about the Trump memorandum on this. Now, many of us who understand the Constitution and the wording of the Constitution in the 14th Amendment, that this is an enumeration of all persons. And if and so we have Supreme Court justices now who are originalists and follow the letter and the quite literally what the law says. And I think that this should be put to bed, that the census includes everybody. But we'll see what happens and what the Supreme Court may decide to do. Will California lose a seat? We went into this census thinking that California was at danger of losing the seat, even with a good count. Simply because even though our population may be growing in the state, it's just not growing as fast as the populations of Arizona, Texas, and Florida. So when you divide the 435 seats, it has to be a sense of, equal size populations among the districts across the country. So California is always on the cusp of losing a seat. The irony was that there were some estimates that if in fact the Census Bureau was forced to cut off the counting earlier, that they were so far behind in Texas and in Louisiana and in Florida that it may actually have helped California. So we'll see what happens with the apportionment count. Now, the other data set that is, I think, of more concern to us is going to be the redistricting file. That is where we absolutely need much more detailed characteristic data for redistricting purposes. I'm talking here about age and also race and ethnicity. And this is where the Census Bureau is going to need the time to try to complete that and make it as accurate as possible. I'm confident that the Bureau is no way going to reach its statutory deadline of delivering the apportionment count by December 31st, which is what the president wanted, before he leaves office. I don't know how far into January they're going to be able to release the data, but it'll probably be sometime in the first 2 weeks of January. So the official apportionment count may not even be known until after January 20th, which is an interesting dynamic. The redistricting file right now has to be delivered by April 1, 2021. But again, a new administration may give the Bureau some more leeway and push it into July as the Census Bureau wanted. The quality of the data, I think, is still, the jury is out on it, and we'll see what happens in these developments. And then you asked about the districts, how we won the easy ones.
Yeah.
By and large, yes. The majority Latino districts that we would ordinarily consider to be Latino voting rights seats. But if you look at some of these other districts, the Central Valley seat is a heavily Latino seat. That there's seats in South Central LA County that are heavily Latino. Nene Barragan's victory there, I think, is an indication of that there is still work to be done in some of these areas. And ultimately, I think we need crossover candidates that can appeal to non-Latinos, which is why the success of candidates like Gascon as district attorney in LA County, of Nora Vargas being elected to the County Board of Supervisors in San Diego, the election of Todd Gloria to being mayor of San Diego as well, who identifies as Latino, that the extent we're able to develop this bench of candidates that are attractive, not just to Latino voters, but to a broad coalition, that's what's going to get us to increasing our numbers in the Congress and in other levels of government.
Let me make a few comments and then have you kind of react to this, Arturo. Obviously, Matt and I talked about the role of Latinos in transforming California politics. There is clearly a major democratic, progressive electoral regime that has led to California now being all democratic in terms of statewide elections and tremendous majorities in state legislative seats, in terms of the big cities, et cetera. Latinos are clearly part of that coalition, and in my mind, are being treated as equal partners. They get to push legislation, and there's always representation there. That's clearly a point. But I also see a second type of coalition that emerges every once in a while. The coalition that beat Proposition 15, and Proposition 16, and that is the business community taking away and not being so focused with Republicans, but beginning to support moderate Democrats, including a lot of Latinos, and then being able to create a counter coalition, situational, every once in a while, with moderate Democrats, Republicans, and independents to counteract that progressive regime. And that's, I think, the coalition that you saw emerge and defeat Proposition 15. I don't know that that coalition can win with a candidate statewide, because that's, your candidate has to be more clear in terms of where they are. So that's one thing that I see happening, and Latinos are part of both of that coalition. They're part of the broader progressive democratic regime, and then they are part of that sometimes moderate Republican business regime that happens statewide. That's a trend that I clearly see. Second, just to your point about crossover candidates, you clearly see that in some areas, Republicans are choosing to have ethnic women as candidates. Suzette Martinez, who just won the assembly seat that Christy Smith won, Melissa Melendez, who's a Republican state senator, and then in Orange County, you see this with Michelle Steele, Asian American woman, and then Young Kim, Asian American woman. And so in terms of the symbolic candidates that Republicans are putting up, is they get to peel away some women, and they get to peel away an ethnic group, at least a portion. They're not gonna get the majority, but then with the Republicans that they have there. And so there is this sense of the type of candidates that they are fielding. So speak to those two general trends, and I have a couple more questions, or just your reaction to that.
Well, I think you're on point with regard to both of those trends. And I think it goes really to the challenge we have in the Latino community, is that we need to develop and nurture and support candidates that have crossover appeal, and field them in districts with the support of either political party, so that they can launch viable candidates and not just be, token candidates running for a seat for the legislature or Congress, but truly viable. And what we've seen in the election of 4 Latinos to statewide office is that in California now, Latinos can win in at-large situations, meaning where Latinos are not the majority of the vote. But I think it requires the support of the political infrastructure of the respective parties. And, the Republican Party here in the past has shown that it is willing to invest in some candidate development. You had I forgot the name of the group, Grow, that Ruben Barrales used to run down in San Diego, to run Republican candidates for local office, and to start developing that, Grow Elect, to start developing that bench by running candidates in nonpartisan races for city council, for school board, and developing the bench. You need political parties to have that investment on both sides. And it takes resources, and it takes a commitment to do that.
So this, a lot of our audience right now, this is the Latino Caucus of the California League of Cities. There have been 2 major laws that have really began impacting local elections. One is the redistricting, where many cities are changing to district elections instead of at-large. And the theory says that when you start doing that, you're going to elect a lot more Latinos. It's just started to do that. The initial elections, more Latinos were elected, but not as many as we expected. A second law says that if your turnout is pretty low, that you have to move your election, if it's off year, to on year during the presidential or gubernatorial election. Again, we're just seeing the beginning of that. And again, the theory is that more Latinos will get elected with that higher turnout. And again, there was growth, but not the same amount of growth that we expected. Many of us think that this will really increase as you said, candidate recruitment and the infrastructure improves. What are your thoughts about that?
We make a distinction at NALEO in terms of what is the performance of the Latino electorate and what is the performance of Latino candidates. They're not always the one and the same. There are circumstances that give Latino candidates an edge, the drawing of a district, the demographics of a district, how well funded they are, what kind of campaign and messaging they're able to do. And then you have a different dynamic in terms of Latino voter turnout. Now, I think the voter turnout, by moving elections to even, from off year to midterm and presidential year, is good for Latinos in terms of it will increase our turnout. But I think to say that if you increase Latino voter turnout, you necessarily increase the number of Latino elected officials are not something that necessarily flow from each other, because as we've seen in the past, Latino voters will not necessarily always vote for the Latino candidate. You know, Latino voters have a certain level of independence and sophistication, and they're going to look at candidates and not just at the last name.
So I want to turn it back over to John Arriaga, but also make the following observation that especially in California, you're seeing a critical mass of voters, and Latinos really do matter in California. You also, and I think Naleo has documented this, you see a critical mass of elected officials at school boards, cities, counties now increasingly, and of course, the congressional and state legislative offices, and then the 4 statewide. So you're seeing that critical mass. But there's also a critical mass now of organizations, not only Naleo, but other legacy organizations like MALDEP, et cetera, but all kinds of new organizations that are really being politically active. And also in my area of academics, there's a critical mass. I know that when my wife saw the picture of these 4 old white guys, excuse me, old white guys, 4 old Latino guys, she said, hey, where's the diversity? And there is tremendous amount of now political analysts, et cetera. And so we have Mindy Romero, great political scientist at USC, Sonia Diaz at UCLA. Right now, I think Christina Mora heads up the Institute for Government Studies at Berkeley, and she actually replaced Lisa Garcia. And we've asked some of them, it's just the time didn't work out. But there are many more Latina elected officials, many more Latinas heading up organizations, and many more Latina analysts and PhDs that are coming up and doing some great work. So I just wanted to mention that. And John, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Fernando and Arturo. I think this was a breath of fresh air. I think, you know, we all, like I said earlier at the beginning, was a real growth spurt for the Latino vote nationwide, and got a lot of attention in the media. I think it's something to build on. It's a lot different this time around, talking about you know, Latinos with their numbers, but they didn't vote. This time, I think we've got something to build on, because we certainly did have an impact in many states, as Arturo explained, and Matt also, and so it's encouraging. I appreciate the time that you all put in, Fernando, for sharing this, and Fernando and I were just chatting about this a couple of weeks ago, and we thought it'd be a good idea to put something like this together after the election. So this was something we did in a matter of 2 weeks, but I think it was very informing information to our audience. We had a great turnout. Arturo, as always, thank you so much for supporting us and being there for us, and it was great to have Matt on. So I hope you all enjoyed it. If you want more information, please go to CA Cities, Latino Caucus.org for more information. We have other webinars coming on soon in the next month or so. So we hope you'll stay with us. And again, thank all of you, and thank you, audience, for the participation. Talk to you again soon.